Welcome to Unfinished Work, The Road to Women's Suffrage. This event is sponsored by MassMutual. MassMutual was founded on the principle of people protecting people. In celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage, we can collectively learn from the brave women of the past and look out for those who continue to strive to make a better world today. Because together, we're much stronger. Live Mutual. MassMutual. To learn more, visit massmutual.com.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the very first conversation in Unfinished Work, our new series investigating the ongoing battle for women's rights in America. I'm Jennifer Schuessler, culture reporter at the New York Times. Today's conversation is called The Road to Women's Suffrage, and we're going to be exploring the road to the 19th Amendment, which became part of the Constitution 100 years ago this summer, and the women who made it happen, including those whose work has been less celebrated. Then we're going to take a look at the legacy and impact of the amendment on the ongoing fight for equality today. I'm pleased to be joined by a really incredible panel. We have Martha Jones, Clarke Lemay, and Susan Ware. We're also going to be joined a bit later by Valerie Jarrett, who's board chair of When We All Vote and co-chair of the United States of Women. But first, let me take a moment to introduce our extraordinary guests. Martha Jones is Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor at Johns Hopkins University, and the author of the upcoming book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Right to Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. Martha, welcome. Clarke Lemay is a historian at the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian, where she recently curated the exhibition Votes for Women, A Portrait of Persistence. Kate, welcome.
Thank you.
And we have Susan Ware, who is currently serving as the honorary women's suffrage centennial historian at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. She's a celebrated biographer and author of the recent book, Why They Marched, Untold Stories of the Women Who Fought for the Right to Vote. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you.
And we definitely want to hear from all of you in the conversation. So while we're talking, you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom. We'll answer some of them closer to the end of the hour. Please also note this event is being recorded. So first of all, I just want to sort of set the table by saying this is one of many events that are going to be taking place across the country, or I should say across American cyberspace, to mark the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which was adopted in 1920. And just to jog everybody's memory of what the 19th Amendment actually was, what it said. So it's a short text that said, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." It was adopted a few months before the election of 1920, and it resulted in what historians say was the single largest enfranchisement of new voters in American history. It's often said that the amendment gave women the right to vote, but as historians like those on our panel will say, like, that's not exactly right. It's more complicated than that. First of all, the right to vote wasn't something women were given, but something they fought for extremely hard for several generations in the face of intense opposition. And while many, many women from across the country fought, the benefits weren't really shared by all women. Even after the amendment was passed, African-American women and men were still largely blocked from voting by discriminatory state laws. It really took the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for the promise of the 19th Amendment to come true for all American women, and other women of color also faced barriers. And this is part of the complex story that historians like the ones we're talking to today have helped really unearth over the past several decades. And also I'd like to say suffrage is kind of a very dusty, old-fashioned kind of sounding word, but what we're really talking about are voting rights. And that's very much an issue that continues into the present. It isn't just a matter of history, which I think we're going to talk about today. So first, let's get talking. And I would really like to ask each of our three historians to kind of reflect briefly on the bigger picture. Like, what does it mean that we're taking this year to talk about this history, about this women's history, which is also American history? What are we doing? Are we celebrating, commemorating, complicating? Why is it important to be talking about history at this moment in history? So maybe I'll start with Martha.
Well, superb. And thanks very much, Jenny, for moderating and leading the discussion. When we started to approach this year, some of the first things I encountered were plans for floats and parties, T-shirts, and all kinds of celebrations of the anniversary. And I confess, as a historian, it was awkward, that I wasn't sure that what I had to add would actually contribute to a celebratory note, because as you so clearly laid out in your introduction, for the African American women whom I write about, the 19th Amendment is an event, but it is at best an incomplete event when it comes to voting rights. So I think for me, this year is really an opportunity to restore more of that story to our shared understanding of the long history of voting rights. I want people to take away from this year the strong sense that when they encounter a figure like Stacey Abrams or Ayanna Pressley or Michelle Obama, that these are African-American women who don't come out of nowhere. To the contrary, they come out of a oftentimes distinct but important and powerful history of the ways in which African-American women too fought for voting rights, sometimes alongside and sometimes in tension with women who led the suffrage movement.
Okay. Susan, your thoughts about the meaning of talking about this history at this moment in history?
Well, clearly the passage of the 19th Amendment was an incredibly important milestone for American women's history and for American history in general. And what I hope comes out of all the celebration and commemoration that's going along with us is that people realize that that was not the end of the story. In many ways, it was just the beginning of the story. And clearly, what still needs to be done for African American women's voting rights is just one part of a larger ongoing struggle for voting rights, for women's political mobilization. So I see this as a moment to connect the history that came before, to share it, but very much to put it in conversation with where we are today and where we're going from now.
Kate?
Yeah, I agree with my panelists. And I'm a public historian, and my role has been to sort of present the American public at the Smithsonian, all of our visitors, with this history that not a lot of people really know about. And that's, to me, that's been puzzling, and that's been aggravating. And, I was lucky because my exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery opened in 2019. I mean, we had no idea the pandemic was going to happen, but that's sort of where it fit in with our exhibition schedule. So we were able to query this very complicated history and put many faces to it through this exhibition and through the catalog, the book that I published. And the thing that I have learned, and that I would hope, kind of comes into our conversation today, is how little we know about American women, period. And how, by naming 60 women in this exhibition, I was able to present all these new biographies to the masses, and they really liked it. And so one thing I would charge us today is to look at suffrage history and ask, why hasn't it been, more celebrated, more questioned? Why isn't this information out there that we really should know beyond maybe two people's names?
Yeah. So you mentioned two people's names, and I think now maybe we can dive a little bit into the history, and we're going to circle back as we progress to the present and bring Valerie into the conversation as well. And so, I mean, I think if any of us did learn any of this history in school, maybe we sort of vaguely remember, we heard of Susan B. Anthony, maybe we've seen the coin she was on, which now you can't even find. Maybe you have some vague notion of what she did. Maybe you've heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, maybe a little bit of Sojourner Truth around the edges. But, I think there's a version of the story that used to be told. Yeah. And what historians like yourself have been doing is kind of adding to the story, including the story of origins. So how did this all get started? And I think maybe we'll kind of flip the order around now, and I'll go to Susan first. What do we know about the many different beginnings of this history?
Oh, that's even one of those contested things that historians argue about. Where do you start this movement? And it used to be, everyone said 1848, Seneca Falls, but clearly—
What was that? Remind us, because not everybody listening may know. Yeah.
The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 is often seen as the first women's rights convention in the United States, and that is where the demand for the vote was first enunciated. And yet we know that events like that just don't come out of nowhere. And so the clear background to that is in the abolition movement, which is just so central to the emergence of women's rights in this country and to the whole story of suffrage and feminism from there forward. So I started back in the 1830s, and Martha may start it even further back than that.
Yeah, Martha, what would you say? Where do you start?
Susan knows me well enough to know that I'm going to try and take us back in time a little bit. But before I do, I think it's important to say one of the things that I've learned in this year is from the work of historian Lisa Tetreault, whose book, The Myth of Seneca Falls, really explains to us how it was that women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony sort of elevated and promoted that event, perhaps outsized it in its historical significance as a way of attempting to tell their version of the history of women's suffrage. But my version of the history would take us back to the 18 teens and 20s. For African-American women, the talk about rights, about political power, the talk about what it means to live at the vexed crossroads of racism and sexism really begins, for example, in African-American churches, when very talented, very committed Black preaching women begin to look to have authority in their church communities, to be preachers, to speak from the pulpit. This is the kind of debate out of which Black women will develop a set of principles that will take them into debates about political rights as we enter the 1840s and 1850s. But I think it's fair to say, without those path-breaking women, Jarena Lee, who is a Methodist preacher, unparalleled in the teens and the 20s, is someone who really lays the groundwork for a more express conversation and debate about political rights that will follow.
Yeah, and Kate, I mean, I'm curious about your thoughts on what they've said, and I'm also struck by a thread that's emerging too of the role of the suffragists themselves in cultivating the history and the memory of the movement, telling the story in a certain way. So what would you say about the role of women in actually creating this history, telling this history, preserving this history?
That's a great question, because women were really excluded from having a narrative. And in my exhibition and in my book, I start with 1832 with the Liberator's publication. First time they ever had a ladies department column in the Liberator.
It was, because I'm not sure everybody knows.
The Liberator was published by William Lloyd Garrison, and it was, the big abolitionist newspaper. And when they gave the women, a voice in this major newspaper, I think some of these discussions that were maybe kept in more private scenarios started emerging as a public discourse. And that is interesting because the Grimke sisters, were arguing that women should be allowed to speak in public in the 1830s, 1840s. And today we can't even imagine, we're 4 women right now speaking to each other, and to how many thousands, I don't know, are listening in. But it's very interesting to think about how far we've come, and we don't, bat an eye. But in the 1830s, yeah, it was a big deal. And the whole expression, like, get off your soapbox, I mean, that comes from the suffrage movement of these women standing on soapboxes, trying to project their voices to reach a large crowd of people. And as a public historian, I'm always dealing with objects. So for me, sometimes the narrative gets cloudy if I can't find something to really kind of put in to represent that chapter. So I'm really excited for Martha's work. And I love Susan's work because they're able to kind of dig in, to these other corners.
Yeah, I want to circle back in a little bit to some of the amazing objects, that are in your show, and some of the amazing stories you unearthed, that you've all unearthed, really. But first, I think we maybe need to dwell a little bit on this sort of issue of a constitutional amendment, because again, as I tried to touch on in my intro, there's a little bit of fogginess around what the 19th Amendment, what did it actually say or do, what did it not do? How did a constitutional amendment, like, where does this amendment come from, and how did that come to seem like the solution to the problem, if it was? Why did this sort of movement, this feminist movement in the 19th century, come to be so oriented around a constitutional amendment, and what's the legacy of that? A lot of big question. So Martha, you're, as a lawyer and a historian.
Yeah, let's let Martha go.
Yes, Martha gets to answer that.
Thank you, Susan. I'm happy to. There's a long story about the ways in which constitutional thinking and constitutional rights come to be fused with thinking about the rights of women. I think for our purposes today, it's important to recognize that there are many ways in which the 19th Amendment is a child of and parallels the 15th Amendment, which had been adopted in 1870 to prohibit the states and the federal government from using race as a criteria for meting out voting rights. And when Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafts what becomes the 19th Amendment, which she does many decades before it's finally ratified, but she deliberately and expressly mirrors the language of the 15th Amendment and uses the word sex rather than race. I think it's important, as we parse the language, to recognize that there is no guarantee to anyone of a right to vote by the language of the 19th Amendment. It is an amendment that prohibits the states and the federal government from using sex. But as we know, it still leaves the states with the latitude to deny women the vote by means other than the express invocation of their sex. And for African American women, that will of course mean that Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, whites-only primaries, other intimidation, lynching will continue to keep them from the polls even after the 19th Amendment. Its language does not prohibit that kind of interference with voting rights.
Yeah, and I think one thing that maybe it's important to make clear is that voting rights have, under these two amendments, they were always left to the states who make their own rules, and I mean that's to a large extent still true today.
Right.
And I think also, like, one other reason why we can't say that 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote is that in a number of states prior to 1920, women had gotten the right to vote in that state, maybe sometimes just in school elections, but it's an incredibly complicated patchwork. And here, I wonder if, I mean, this, I wish we could talk for 3 hours about all of this, but I wonder if Kate and Susan, because the Kate's exhibition and Susan's book, you really highlight individual stories and this tremendous diversity of women, white women, African American women, Native American women, Asian American women, and for every group, it's kind of a complicated, different story, and often it depended what state you were in. So I wondered if you could talk, each of you could talk a little bit, building on what Martha said, but talk a little bit about specific women involved in specific struggles in specific places that you found especially fascinating, revelatory, relevant to today, however you would put it.
Well, I think one of the things that I tried to do as a biographer was to think about how social movements happen. And it's real people being involved in them on the ground. It isn't just national leaders. It's not just national organizations. And so that was how I entered the story. And so then what it allows you to do is to really get down much deeper and see what's going on in specific states, who's doing what, why is it much faster in the West? I mean, what the victory's much earlier in the West. And along the way, you discover these incredible women who are doing things like climbing Mount Rainier and putting a Votes for Women banner on top of it, and writing suffrage novels and marching in parades and being willing to go to jail. And when you put individual names and faces with this broader social movement, I think it really makes it come alive to modern readers. And it also gives you a clue of how social movements happen, which is with real people and real women. And so that's where I think biography really helps us. It also helps us to diversify the cast of characters in dramatic ways. So they're not all from New York, they're not all white, they're not all middle class. And I think that's been one of the most important contributions of the centennial scholarship that has been coming out as part of this moment.
Kate, I wonder if you could talk about that, because I think walking into your exhibit, it was really overwhelming to see these amazing portraits of it. Was it like 60 women?
Yeah.
Huge diversity. And I just speaking personally, I felt like, well, I knew a little bit about African-American women activists, but I knew nothing about Native American women and how they relate to this history, or Asian American women. And
it was hard to find.
I don't know, one or two women you could talk about that are these great stories that also illustrate these larger.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll mention two women. One is Anna Elizabeth Dickinson, who was born in 1842, and she was really an incredible speaker, who at the age of 18, spoke about the Civil War, and so she became a girl orator, was sort of her nickname. And she inspired so many other women to get out there and speak publicly about women's rights. And she was speaking about women's rights. She was also a bit partisan. She criticized Lincoln. And at 18 years old, she was this sort of phenomenon. And she was lecturing up and down the East Coast and then all over. And so she's one person that I think is an interesting figure. In 1872, she made $23,000 on the lecture circuit, which at the time was, for our standards today, is about $400,000.
Wow.
And she made more money than Mark Twain. And so my question to you and to our listeners and to our viewers is, whose name do you know? Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, or Anna Elizabeth Dickinson? And then you can, and what Susan was saying, biography is so important, but the biographies that have been written and paid attention to are about men. I think I read in Slate, there's like a publication in 2016 that 70 to 80% of historians in the US are male. And of course, they're going to write about male history. That's just one of the things that happens when you can relate and you're interested, from your own experiences. So I think that's one reason why Anna Elizabeth Dickinson has not been recalled very well. Even though Matthew Brady took her portrait, she was selling it, she was making gobs of money. It's sort of a puzzle to us today to try to connect what went wrong there. And then of course there's Ida B. Wells, and I know my colleagues here are going to speak about her, but I do have to, I really love this portrait that we have of her from 1893 by Sally Garrity, and it's she's about 30 years old, and she's just emerged from this trauma in Memphis, Tennessee, where her, one of her best friends was lynched, and that's when she really becomes this activist. But she's this young woman who is beautifully dressed, and what Susan was saying, like there's a bridge that you make through biography. Same thing with portraits. You look at this pristine portrait that we have in our collection, and it feels like you can talk to this woman. And this is Ida B. Wells, So
yeah.
There's a lot to say for biography and the named woman. I loved Veronica Chambers and I forget her colleague's project, the Mrs. Files, that came out over the weekend, because it just points out how many Mrs. there are, and they don't even have a first name, they're just their husband's name. And, you know, so there's a lot of work to be done, I think, to uncover women's biography and link it to this really interesting history. Yeah, I think we're going to be hearing more about Ida B. Wells, hopefully this hour, and certainly in this coming few months with this centennial. And I think, yes, I know exactly the photo you're talking about. So I think it's time to introduce our other panelist, Valerie Jarrett, who should pop on screen any minute. And
There.
hello? Oh,
Hi,
there's
Valerie.
Hello, everybody. I have been loving this conversation.
excellent.
It's good to be with you.
So Valerie Jarrett is board chair of the organization When We All Vote and co-chair of the group The United State of Women. And many of you also know her as a former senior advisor to President Barack Obama. So first of all, I want to ask you a version of the question I started with everybody else. But tell us a little bit about When We All Vote, because we are talking about voting and we're in fact in the middle of a presidential election. So
Yes. So When We All Vote is a 501c3 organization, nonpartisan, that Michelle Obama, our former First Lady, launched a couple of years ago. And I chair the board, and we have a whole group of co-chairs. And the reason for the creation of the organization is looking at the last presidential election, when something like 100 million eligible Americans did not vote, like 43% of our country didn't vote. And what we are realizing, if you dig a little bit deeper in those numbers, is that they're disproportionately young people, and often people of color. And so our organization was designed to really change the culture in our country around voting, and particularly closing both the gender and the race gap. And so and I should point out, we're not just focusing on any one election or any one candidate, since we're nonpartisan, because we all know, look at matters who's on your local school board or the city council, or prosecutors, who is in the General Assembly of your states, and who is in Congress providing a check and balance to the executive branch, who are the judges who are running for office. And so every election matters, and we want to reach people where they are. And so we've been doing all kinds of great initiatives before the COVID-19 started. We had a rally planned with Mrs. Obama. She did a few before the last midterm elections. And now actually we're becoming much more creative, because we're having to use technology as our friend, and also solicit a whole big group of ambassadors to go out there with us, influencers who can talk about voting, talk about issues, and why it is important to not shun institutions like government, but actually, if you don't like them, exercise that minimum responsibility of citizenship and get in there and vote, and try to then affect policies that are made that affect your lives and the lives of those you care about. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Our creativity now is, dropping into this famous DJ Nice, who has couch parties, and Mrs. Obama will go on and try to get volunteers to help us and sign up and participate, because we know we have an election coming up. But even the off-year elections are all important, up and down, state, local, and federal. So that's it in a nutshell.
Well, this sort of leads me into well, first, I want to just ask you for your quick take on the question I asked all of them at the beginning. What do you see as the importance of this centennial now? Like, how does it connect to?
Well, I am a student of history, and I think it's really important to use it as an opportunity to tell our history. So, for example, one of the proudest monuments that the one that I feel the most pride about, that President Obama established while he was in office, is sorry, my phone's ringing, is the Belmont Hall Women's Equity Monument, that used to be the home of the National Women's Party for 90 years, which was the epicenter of where a lot of the work around women's suffrage occurred. And at the announcement that he did in April 12th of his last year in office, 2016, he really talked about the arc of women's rights, voting being an important piece of it, but to look at it at the context, in the context. And I think if you go back and look at his words those days, it really did kind of mirror Martin Luther King's arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and to frame it in the context of the work that lies ahead. And so I think it's important to tell the story of history. And the final point I'd make on this is, 1 year for my birthday, he gave me an amazing gift. It was a copy of the signed copy of the Petition for Universal Suffrage, signed back in 1866, framed alongside of the congressional resolution introducing the proposed 19th Amendment, which was actually a year earlier, 1919. 53 years in between the two. And it was a reminder for me that change takes time. And that a lot of the women who were part of that original suffrage, the hunger strikes and the demonstrations, and whose husbands shunned them, they didn't actually live to see its passage. And that's kind of the message to young people today, is that you have to just continue the hard work. And once in a while, it feels like a thunderbolt, as I'm sure it did the day it was passed. And then the next day, get back to work, because there's still more work to do. And I think reminding us of that history and that long arc, but that progress is made, hopefully motivates particularly the younger generation that have a nanosecond attention span and who disproportionately do not vote, to appreciate their responsibility as citizens.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I hope I'm not getting this history too wrong. The 1866 petition for universal suffrage, there was an effort right after the Civil War. Some of the suffragists and their male allies wanted everybody, all citizens, men and women, Black and white, to be able to vote. That's not what happened. Extremely complicated story, but
no, you're right.
Another, what was it, 50 some years for the 19th Amendment to be passed, which included women in a very incomplete way. But now I kind of want to pivot to a little bit, like a little more history, taking it forward from 1920. Like what happened right after this was passed? Like, did women vote? Was it only white women who voted? I know, Black women also tried to vote. What happened? So, well, Martha, I'm going to pick that up. I know you've this is something you've talked about. Yeah.
Martha, you're muted.
You're muted.
Hi.
There you are.
So there are two myths, I think, about that moment in 1920. One is that all women vote, and the other is that African American women do not. And neither is quite correct. That we're able to recover the extraordinary efforts that African American women make throughout the country, including in the American South, coming to the polls, confronting registrars, training themselves to pass literacy tests, organizing to pay poll taxes, all of the things that they do in anticipation of overcoming that hurdle and being able to get to the polls. And of course, the story is, as Jenny, you've already suggested, it is a patchwork. It is uneven. And so there's the extraordinary story of Mary McLeod Bethune, the founder of Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona, Florida, who on the eve of Election Day in 1920, after having spent months in a campaign to register Black voters, men and women in Florida, will confront the Ku Klux Klan when they appear on her campus to attempt to intimidate her, and by extension, all African Americans in Daytona. She sort of stares them down and gets up the next morning to join other African American women at the polls right there in 1920. So it's to say that there isn't one story, but it is, I would say, a moment of incompleteness, right? That there is still work to do with respect to voting rights in the United States. African American women will be left, unfortunately, I would say, largely alone to continue that work. That suffragists like Alice Paul will move on to other important causes like the Equal Rights Amendment, but African American women will stay in the trenches of voting rights for many decades, as you suggested at the opening, until we come certainly to 1965 and finally the adoption of the Voting Rights Act in that year.
Yeah. Susan, what's your perspective on this? This sort of if we pick up the story, this amendment passes, what happens? Like, what are the important things to know?
Well, I think the important thing to know is that it really did make a difference. It wasn't like women got the vote and everybody just went back to sleep the next morning. I think what changed is that a large mobilization of women around a single issue was no longer in place. But there was no diminution of the political energy on the part of women. It just scattered into a range of activities. And one of the things that I've done throughout my career as a historian is look at the various places that that political mobilization goes in the years after 1920. I think we also need to remember that as we trace the suffrage legacy, there's a second legacy, which is the anti-suffragists that we didn't have a chance to talk about. And we need to always remember that not all women supported the vote, not all women agree on women's issues or women's rights, and that is an important part of the story before the 19th Amendment is passed, and especially in the 100 years since then.
Yes, and I think if anyone's been watching Mrs. America, which I know we talked about earlier, you got a bit of a snapshot of just how complicated it became and still is. Before we come to the present, and I'd really love to get a kind of, again, Valerie's perspective, I wanted to hit on one more point, which it's so hard to get everything in, but Kate, one thing that, again, is really fascinating about your exhibit is the way it talked about the issues for Native American women and Asian American women were for them.
Right.
It has much to do with the fact that they did not necessarily even have the rights to be citizens. So can you give us a little bit of a snapshot? I know it's
tough, right, to summarize this because, and I'm not going to do it justice, but the Native Americans weren't considered American citizens, weren't granted American citizenship until 1924. And so when that happens, obviously 1920 didn't mean anything to them. And they also were reluctant to give up their own sovereignty to their own tribes. And this is a conundrum that, remains to this day. And they've worked out lots of diplomatic, sort of relationships to work around that. The Kathleen Cahill is a scholar who has written a lot about this, and I really respect her work. And she's, quick to point out that the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois women, were held up, by Martha Jocelyn Gage as women who were the leaders, of their clan. And I think that Native Americans have, been negotiating these difficult, complex politics for forever. And Asian Americans as well, with the the Exclusion Acts in the 1880s and on, the limiting of their immigration and their rights. So the representation of women of color, of people of color in Congress to this day is very much, reflects these kinds of exclusionary rules and laws for these groups. Not to mention Latina women as well. In Puerto Rico, it wasn't until 1932 and then 1935 that women were granted the right to vote. And it was tricky there as well because they were thinking about literate suffrage before universal suffrage. Similar dynamics, Yeah.
And I think this maybe kind of brings us into the present because, even though under the law, at least in theory, we have universal suffrage for American citizens, in reality, there are a lot of barriers to voting that many people encounter. And I'd be curious seems like when we're talking about women's suffrage, it feels like, it's a thing in the past. When you start to talk about voting rights, it's a much more charged, contested conversation and subject. And Valerie, as someone who's working to get people registered, get people showing up, change what you call the culture around voting, what do you see as the kind of state of voting rights today? What are the most significant barriers, and what do we need to do to bring them down?
Well, I am very troubled by a number of states that have put in place rigorous, onerous voting registration requirements, which in a sense disenfranchise folks. And my best example is like in the state of Texas, you can't use your student identification to prove that you are eligible to vote, but you can use your license to carry firearms. We also have different states that, as a matter of practice, not as a matter of law, but are also trying to suppress the vote. throwing people off the rolls, not telling them they can exercise their right to vote with provisional ballots, whole host of ways in which there are attempts to suppress the vote. And Stacey Abrams is one of the folks who's out there organizing, and I think it's 19 states now trying to address where there are these either legal or practical implications that are suppressing the vote. We also have the way there's gerrymandering all around the country. Eric Holder, the former Attorney General for the United States, is leading up an effort focusing on redistricting and seeing how we can make sure that we have proper representation. So there are lots of efforts to suppress the vote. And the one that I'm focusing on, of course, is let's not suppress our own vote. And so the other organization that I co-chair, the United States of Women, really grew out of the White House Council on Women and Girls that I chaired for the 8 years we were in the White House. And it's also a not-for-profit 501c3 that's trying to close the gender gap in a whole host of different ways, from equal pay, paid leave, paid sick days, affordable childcare, making sure that we don't have implicit or explicit biases in our toys and entertainment, healthcare for women, whole range of issues that are important to women and girls. And so we're partnering with When We All Vote because we know that oftentimes women can be very influential as to not only whether they vote, as in the case in Alabama, where African-American women are really responsible for Doug Jones, the first Democrat in, I think, history, becoming the senator in Alabama. So we're really trying to figure out creative new ways of getting women to feel empowered to vote and to be educated about the issues that they will be voting upon. So it's not just voting more women into office, although I'm heartened to say that Congress now has more women in office than ever before in history. And one of the reasons that's important is, many of you might remember when there was a committee in the Senate formed to look at the Affordable Care Act, when they were trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and it was a group of like 19 men. And I said, one of the major provisions of the Affordable Care Act is preventive care for women, including birth control without a copay. Well, I don't want a bunch of guys making that decision about me. I want somebody who understands what that's like to be in the room. And so if you believe that diversity is a strength and inclusion is an asset, then I think there's another lens through which we should be looking at this issue about voting. And so it is challenging because of the different ways that it is suppressed. And let's then look at, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And we saw the lines in Wisconsin, and people were forced to choose between their health and their exercising that right to vote. And with the upcoming election, we're asking for 3 changes. Number one, we want every state to be able to provide voting by mail. And we'd like the post office to be able to have additional resources to handle this influx of additional ballots and to be sending out, self-addressed envelopes so it's not costing people money to vote. We should also expand early vote. There are a lot of people who are in jobs currently, and certainly before, where they were unable to vote on a Tuesday during the week. And it's not a national holiday, so you have to be able to get off of work. And so why not extend that early vote so that people, and particularly women who are disproportionately lower wage workers with less flexibility, they don't have paid time off, they don't have paid leave in many instances, let's let them vote early so that on election day, particularly if we're still in this pandemic, you don't have these long lines that are causing a risk. And also let people vote through technology, register to vote through technology. Everybody should be able to register online. So these are a few of the issues that we're trying to do to remove the barriers, to make it easier and more accessible and certainly fairer for everyone to vote, and to partner with women and encourage them to get on board and help us with this effort.
Yeah, I mean, we're just living through this moment, with respect to everything, but also with respect to elections and voting rights that nobody would have possibly imagined. And you can only imagine what historians 50 years from now will say about all of that. So I'm wondering, before we go to audience questions, I'm wondering if there's maybe Susan, is there something you see from the history of the suffrage movement that is kind of useful as a kind of lesson or a metaphor useful for activists, or not even just activists, people who want to increase the number of Americans who vote? Is there sort of a lesson in the suffrage movement?
Well, I think of suffragists as the voting rights activists of their day. And when you think about all of the energy generations of women put into getting the vote, they knew the vote was important. And I think we need to always keep that in mind. The vote isn't everything, but it's such an important tool. And so I think one way that we can honor this history and also sort of move it forward is by recognizing that voting is an important right of citizenship, and that women and men should certainly take it seriously. And certainly when I go into a polling place, I really feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of suffragists who came before me and won the right to vote just 100 years ago, not that long ago.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now I think we've only unfortunately got about 10 minutes, so I'm going to pivot to some questions from the audience. And so let's see. We touched on this a little bit, but I'd be curious to hear more. So Kim asks, can you speak about the relationship between the suffrage movement and the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and why has the ERA not yet passed? What about people who say the ERA is unnecessary because of the 19th Amendment? Martha, I'm curious what you think about that as a legal historian, among other things.
Well, there's no question, right, that one of the lessons of history is that voting rights, I think, as everybody has said in their own way, is only one part of a much more complex matrix that makes up political power in this country. And really, African-American women live that after 1920, because so many of them are kept from the polls, they become lobbyists. They join party auxiliaries. They become part of the New Deal administrative state, meeting out resources and patronage from inside new federal agencies. That I think part of the lesson is about that kind of nimbleness. And the ERA, I think, represents one important thread in that sort of more sophisticated and more varied understanding of where political power resides and how women might seize it. And voting does some of that, but it doesn't do all of that. And, for the story is an uneven one. I feel like I keep coming back to my story, but I must and say, that it's one of the disappointments for African-American women when Alice Paul moves to the Equal Rights Amendment. They implore Paul to remain in coalition with them or to join in coalition with them and work toward voting rights after 1920. They are disappointed. So this unevenness is part of the ERA story, but I think it's part of a bigger story, which is women really looking to a whole smorgasbord, right, of strategies that might bring them the kind of political power that will permit them to make a difference in places like Washington.
Yeah, here's another question, which is specifically directed at Valerie, but I would also encourage others to comment after she does if they want to. Lynn asks, how can we specifically get young women to vote? You talked about, what can we do to connect them to the importance of this right, this privilege that took so long to obtain?
Lynn, it's a great question. It's part of why When We All Vote is partnering with the United States of Women so that we can focus on issues that we know women care about. And so whether it is our right to choose or paid leave and paid sick days or an environment that's free from sexual harassment or affordable childcare, as we go around the country, as the United States of Women does, and listen first, because it is a grassroots organization, so we depend upon people on the ground to share best practices. Part of what we have to do is to get women to appreciate that there is a nexus between the issues they care about and those who represent us. And when you can draw that line for them, it makes it a little bit easier. And let's face it, a lot of people look at Washington right now and they just go, oh my gosh, it's just a nightmare, the toxicity. But when you see changes that are made because of the influence of voting that affect your life, it's easier. And again, I would say this pandemic has, in a sense, laid bare the efficiency or lack thereof of government at the local, state, and federal level. A lot of people are getting a civics lesson when they're seeing their governor on television. Many of them may not have even known who their governor's name was before, but now they realize how important that person is to whether or not they have the ability to get the health care and the health treatment that they need. So we have to make voting relevant to people's lives. And because the United States of Women has a treasure trove of research that shows what are the issues that women and girls care about, how can we then say, these are the issues that decisions that politicians are making that affect the issues that you care about. And part of the joy or the magic of the effort is that women are getting to know other women, and they're building broad coalitions, and they're realizing that, look, we're not just one issue. And that gets a little bit back to the history you were talking about, is that, it isn't good enough for me to just have a job and an equal pay for a man if I don't have health insurance. It's not good enough for me to have a health insurance if my small business can't get the capital it needs. I mean, all of our issues are intertwined, but the civics lesson is an understanding that voting translates into policies that affect our daily lives. And we have to make it relevant, and we have to meet people where they are.
Kate, I wonder about your sort of perspective on the question as a historian and as a public historian, someone who, made an exhibition aimed at connecting with a broader public, including school kids, young women, not just young women, but, boys. I don't know, what are your thoughts about how to connect this history to issues now?
Right.
I know you sort of do a little bit in your exhibit too.
Well, thanks. I love what Valerie is doing, because she's this sort of contemporary organizer. And the suffragists, if you look back in history, they were brilliant strategists. They were the first to pioneer lobbying. They basically invented it. So there's a lot of echo in what Valerie's doing. Because if you think about the phenomenal reach that these suffragists had through all the chapters, the different, suffrage groups across the country, and then the way that they were able to organize and pass this information amongst each other to then lobby and put pressure on those men who were the ones to vote on giving women the right to vote, right? You have to convince all those men. So I think that needs to be said about the voting history and how to get people to vote today. The other thing that's interesting is that if you go to thepudding.cool, it's a website, they have this incredible information, and they put on a video for my exhibition that analyze the party platform texts of every 4 years, and they have this kind of graphic chart of the Democrats and the Republicans and which texts in their party platforms were actually specific to women. So it's like 400 words, in like 1848. In 2016, there's a lot more. So it's an interesting reflection of how out of touch maybe some of these parties, these political parties, have been with the step that women need them to be in. So that's something that I learned only really from looking at this aggregate incredible research that the Pudding.Cool put together for my exhibition, and then they made it into this kind of cool video. And graphics are so important for our understanding of these big picture histories. And that, for me, was essential for this exhibition, where, I'm using photographs and art objects from 1832 or 1893, but I'm also really trying to capture people's attention with dramatic photos from the National Women's Party, now the Belmont Paul National Monument, and from their archive, which is incredible. If you see all the women picketing in front of the White House, which is the first time any group ever did that. It was women who had that brilliant idea. So there's a lot we can learn strategy in the past and then apply it to the present. And I see it, in groups like the ones that Valerie is chairing. So it's exciting.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think we probably have time for maybe one more question. Let me quickly check here. Okay, here's something a little bit to a slant of our topic, but Jonathan asks, is it possible to imagine the United States ever getting to a model of compulsory voting? Why or why not? I mean,
I love it. I love that idea. I am so excited about that. I think it should be mandatory, and not for just the obvious reasons, because we've been talking about voting as a right, but I actually look at it as a responsibility. And I think that by making it mandatory, it would say something about our culture, that we were prepared to say that this is so important to us that it is a responsibility, just not a right that you can opt out of. And countries like Australia, they have mandatory voting. You're only fined like $25 if you don't vote, but everybody votes. And I think what would happen one of the reasons why I'm a big advocate for it, even though I don't think this Congress obviously would ever do it, is that it would force or allow politicians to come a little bit more towards the middle, because most people are in that bell curve, right?
Yeah.
But oftentimes the energy is at one extreme or the other. And if you had to appeal to everyone, I think that the politics would change dramatically in our country.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious, I mean, is it accurate to say that at present, do women vote at higher rates than men on average, or do we know?
I think it depends on the election. It depends on the candidate. I think it's pretty even. The one that I know is problematic is young people. And that's young men and young women. And the real reason why that's a big problem is well, it's a big problem because they're not voting, but also the evidence shows that if you vote in your first election, when you're first eligible, the chances of you becoming a lifelong voter go up pretty exponentially, because it's a part of your habit. It's a culture. It's something you do. I mean, I used to go to the polls with my parents as a child and treasured those moments. And so not everybody has that experience to make it a part of their family culture. So we have to build that culture throughout society. Yeah,
and maybe this year we'll all go to the mailbox together.
Yes, we could do that.
Yeah, I think we're close to running out of time. I'm wondering if each of you just have I think unfortunately we seem to have lost Kate. Maybe a parting thought to carry people who are interested, other than look up the books of these wonderful historians and some of the historians they've mentioned. I love it that historians are always footnoting. But if there's, I don't know, a thought you would leave people with who want to know more and want to participate in whatever way in this centennial celebration, commemoration, conversation, whatever we call it. I don't know, thoughts to carry people through the summer. Susan?
I guess what I would say is, having spent several years writing a book about the suffrage movement and really diving quite deep into it, it is so much part of my life now. And yet I feel like I'm part of something bigger. It didn't end in 1920. It will go, it's still ongoing, many of the same battles, and they'll be going on long after I'm no longer here. And I find myself very moved and empowered by feeling like I'm part of something bigger. And I think I really take that back to the suffrage movement.
Martha?
Yeah, thank you. You know, the way that I began writing Vanguard was by trying to recover the stories, the voting stories of the women in my own family. These are women descended from enslaved people who live through all of this history that we've described. And one of the things that really moved me was that I didn't know those stories. I really didn't know about my grandmother and my great-grandmother and what 1920 had been like for them in places like St. Louis, Missouri, or Danville, Kentucky, or Greensboro, North Carolina. So one of the things I'd suggest to people, particularly as we're spending a lot of time with one another, with family and with elders, it's a great moment to ask those questions and to learn some of the suffrage history in your own family, and take a moment to write that down and to let that be a keepsake from this year. We talk about a whole lot of things in my family that I never thought we'd get to, but I think some of this family history might be something we can recover in these months.
Kate, welcome back. I'm glad we got you back. Kate, and then Valerie, parting thoughts. Something you suggest people do or investigate to kind of, if they're curious to know more, learn more, and carry the sort of spirit of this centennial, whatever it is, forward. Can you hear? Oh, I think Kate is frozen. Hello, Kate? Okay, maybe we'll go with Valerie, see if we get Kate back. Valerie, thoughts to something people might want to read about, investigate?
I think the suffrage movement gives me hope. It's what really inspires me. Yes, to feel like I'm a part of something bigger than myself, but also to recognize that real change happens when ordinary people organize together to do extraordinary things. And yes, it's a work in process. We're not done yet. We're never done to perfect our union. But I hope that if people take the time to go back and understand the history, they'll understand that change is hard and that it takes that grit and determination and resilience of spirit but that real change can happen when we organize together. And so I hope that it propels us to feel some momentum and some additional oomph to get behind exercising that important right to vote, and then making sure that we follow up and keep our elected officials accountable. And that's part of the movement too. It isn't just to vote for voting's sake, it's voting as a means to an end to participate in our democracy.
Great. And Kate, you're back. Can you hear us?
Only every other word. I'm so sorry. My internet is unstable. It's been telling me.
Yeah. So
before it boots me off.
Yeah. Something you would recommend. People have heard this. They want to know more. They want to explore the history, the whole subject, something they can do throughout the next couple months of this as we move towards August, the climax, whatever it is, of the centennial. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean,
to engage.
I think that a lot of you are getting your ballots in the mail, so definitely vote. And visit the various websites that the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission has, a lot of different programs, and Smithsonian as well. So there's a lot of books out there too, obviously.
Yeah, that's great. And I would just, before we close, I would really urge everybody to look up the books of these wonderful historians on the panel and look at their websites. It's going to point you in a lot of directions. It's this history that went on so long, was so complicated, so many women. It's fascinating. And you know, I'm not going to read it all this year either. So anyway, thank you all for joining us for the Road to Women's Suffrage, the first event in our Unfinished Work series. I want to thank Martha, Susan, Kate, and Valerie for such a great discussion. Our next event is next week, Tuesday, May 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern, and the series continues throughout the summer. To find out more about our full slate of digital events at the Times, please visit timesevents.nytimes.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.